The scraping sound of my plow blade against asphalt at 5 in the morning had become such a familiar rhythm over the past 15 winters that I barely noticed it anymore. But apparently, someone else did. I was halfway through clearing my driveway in Meadowbrook Heights, Minnesota, when I saw her marching toward me in a neon pink bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, arms waving like a windmill in a tornado. Even through the frosted windows of my truck cab, I could tell she was screaming. I killed the engine and rolled down my window, letting in a blast of February air that felt like needles against my face. The woman was now standing directly beside my door, her face so red it nearly matched the angry welts of frostbite forming on her exposed ankles. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" she shrieked, her breath forming angry little clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. I checked my watch with exaggerated slowness. "About 5:15, madam." "Exactly, 5:15 in the morning. And you're out here making enough noise to wake the entire neighborhood with that monstrosity." She jabbed a finger at my perfectly legal and properly maintained snow plow attachment. "Madam, we got 8 inches last night. I need to clear my driveway before I head to work at 6:30. I don't care if we got 8 feet. There are noise ordinances in this community, and as the HOA president, I'm telling you that you're in violation." That's when I recognized her. Deborah Patterson, the woman who'd moved into the neighborhood about 6 months ago and immediately started making everyone's life miserable. She'd sent violation notices to the Hendersons for having their garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though their garage door had broken and they were waiting for repairs. She'd fined the Kowalskis $200 because their mailbox post was painted forest green instead of the approved hunter green. The woman was a menace with a mission, and apparently I was her latest target. "Look, Mrs. Patterson, I understand your concern, but I'm on my own property, using equipment that's well within legal limits, and I'm doing necessary maintenance. There's no violation here." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Morrison. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our HOA bylaws clearly states that no power equipment may be operated before 7 a.m. on weekdays or 8 a.m. on weekends. You're in clear violation, and I'm going to call the police." I felt my jaw tighten. "My name is Zachary Morrison, and I've lived in this house for 23 years. I bought it when my son Jake was just 5 years old, right after my wife passed away from cancer. I'd raised him here, taught him to ride a bike on these very streets, and watched him grow into a fine young man. Now he was 28, a police officer with the Meadowbrook Heights Police Department, and I couldn't have been prouder. The irony of Deborah threatening to call the cops wasn't lost on me. "You do what you need to do, madam, but I'm finishing my driveway." Her face somehow managed to turn an even deeper shade of red. "We'll see about that." She stomped back toward her house, which was 3 doors down from mine, nearly wiping out twice on the icy sidewalk. I shook my head and started up the plow again. I had work to do, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president stop me from clearing my own property. I'd gotten through another section when I saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the fresh snow. A squad car pulled up to the curb, and I killed the engine again with a sigh. Through my rearview mirror, I watched as my son stepped out of the vehicle, and I had to suppress a smile. Jake was tall, just over 6 feet, with my dark hair and his mother's kind eyes. He was wearing his standard duty uniform, and even in the dim streetlight, I could see him trying to keep his expression professional as he approached. Deborah came rushing out of her house again, this time with a coat thrown over her bathrobe. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This man has been disturbing the peace and violating our HOA regulations." Jake pulled out his notepad, his voice perfectly level and professional. "Madam, can you explain the nature of the complaint? He's been running that snow plow since before 5 a.m. The noise is absolutely unacceptable, and he's in direct violation of our community bylaws." "I see. And you are Deborah Patterson." "I'm the president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association." Jake nodded, writing something down. Then he walked over to my truck, and I could see the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that he always got when he was trying not to laugh. "Good morning, sir. Can I see your license and registration?" I handed them over through the window, and Jake made a show of examining them carefully. "Mr. Zachary Morrison," he read aloud. "This your residence?" "It is, officer." "And what are you doing out here at this hour?" "Plowing my driveway so I can get to work on time. I'm a facilities manager at the hospital, and my shift starts at 7. Takes me about 20 minutes to get there, so I need to leave by 6:30 at the latest." Deborah had come closer, hovering behind Jake like an angry mosquito. "Aren't you going to cite him? He's clearly in violation." Jake turned to face her, his expression still professionally neutral. "Madam, can you show me the specific city ordinance he's violating?" "It's not a city ordinance. It's an HOA bylaw. Section 12, paragraph 4. "I see. Madam, I need to inform you that HOA bylaws are civil matters, not criminal ones. The police department doesn't enforce HOA rules. That would be something you'd need to take up in civil court or through your HOA's internal processes." "But the noise, surely there's a noise ordinance." Jake flipped through his notepad. "There is a city noise ordinance, yes. It prohibits excessive noise between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. that disturbs the reasonable peace of residents. However, there are exceptions for necessary activities like snow removal, emergency repairs, and other essential maintenance. Given that we received significant snowfall overnight and Mr. Morrison needs to access his vehicle for work, this would fall under that exception." I watched Deborah's face go through a fascinating series of expressions, from confusion to anger to indignation. "That's ridiculous. You're telling me he can make as much noise as he wants?" "No, madam. I'm telling you that he's engaged in necessary property maintenance using equipment that appears to be properly muffled and operating within legal parameters. If the noise from his plow was excessive, say if he'd removed the muffler or was revving the engine unnecessarily, that would be different. But from what I observed when I arrived, he's simply clearing his driveway in a normal fashion. This is unacceptable. I want to speak to your supervisor." Jake remained perfectly calm. "That's absolutely your right, madam. The non-emergency number for the station is on my card." He handed her a business card, and I watched her snatch it from his hand. "You can be sure I'll be calling. This is exactly the kind of thing that ruins neighborhoods. First it's snow plows at 5 a.m., then it's car repairs in driveways, then property values plummet and we're living in a slum." The hyperbole was so extreme that I saw Jake's professional mask slip for just a second, a brief flash of amused disbelief crossing his face before he composed himself again. "Madam, I understand you're concerned about your neighborhood. But I need you to understand that Mr. Morrison isn't breaking any laws. The HOA bylaws are a separate matter that would need to be addressed through proper HOA channels, not through the police department." "Fine, but this isn't over." She pointed at me through my truck window. "You'll be hearing from the HOA board, Mr. Morrison. We have procedures for dealing with people who refuse to be good neighbors." She turned and stormed back to her house, slamming the door hard enough that I heard it from inside my truck. Jake waited until she was inside before walking back over to me. "Morning, Dad," he said, finally letting himself grin. "Seems like you're making friends." I climbed out of the truck, stretching my back. That woman is something else. She moved in last summer and immediately ran for HOA president. Won by default because nobody else wanted the job, and now she acts like she's the mayor of a major city. She seems like a real piece of work. Jake glanced back at her house, shaking his head. You want me to explain the situation more clearly? I can try to make her understand that calling us out here isn't going to accomplish what she wants. Nah, let it go. She'll either figure it out or she won't. I've got to finish this driveway and get ready for work. All right, but heads up, she did say she's going to call my supervisor. That'll be Captain Rodriguez. He's not going to care, but she might try to make a stink about it. Nothing you did wrong. You handled it by the book. I know. It's just annoying when people try to use us to settle personal disputes. Jake checked his watch. I've got to get back on patrol. Stay warm out here, okay? Will do. Thanks for coming out, officer. I gave him a wink and he laughed as he headed back to his patrol car. I watched him drive away before climbing back into my truck. The sky was starting to lighten just slightly in the east, that deep blue-purple that comes right before dawn. I finished plowing my driveway, cleared the sidewalk in front of my house as required by actual city ordinance, and then headed inside to shower and get ready for work. The hot water felt good against my cold skin, and I found myself thinking about Deborah Patterson and her ridiculous threat. The thing about HOAs is that they can be genuinely helpful when run by reasonable people who care about maintaining property values and community standards. But when someone like Deborah gets in charge, someone who sees the position as a way to exert power over their neighbors rather than serve the community, it becomes a nightmare. I got dressed in my usual work clothes, khakis and a polo shirt with the hospital logo, grabbed my lunch from the fridge and headed out. My truck started right up, and I smiled at the perfectly clear driveway. Whatever else happened with Deborah, at least I'd be on time for work. The hospital was busy as always. As facilities manager, my job involved everything from maintaining the HVAC systems to coordinating with contractors for repairs, to making sure the emergency generators were tested and functional. It was demanding work, but I'd been doing it for 15 years and I was good at it. Plus, healthcare doesn't stop for snow, which meant I needed to be there no matter what the weather was doing. Around 10 a.m., I got a text from my neighbor Tom Henderson. Dude, Deborah is going door to door with a petition to have you fined for your snow plowing. Just thought you should know. I sighed and texted back. Thanks for the heads up. Did you sign it? Hell no. I told her she was being ridiculous. Half the neighborhood plows early when we get snow like this. She just has it out for you for some reason. That was the question, wasn't it? Why had Deborah decided to target me specifically? Sure, I'd been plowing early, but so had at least 3 other neighbors. The Kowalskis had been out even earlier than me, their plow rumbling past my house at 4:45. Why wasn't she harassing them? I didn't have time to dwell on it. One of the boilers in the east wing was acting up, and I spent the next several hours crawling through maintenance corridors and checking pressure valves. By the time my shift ended at 3:30, I'd mostly forgotten about the whole incident. But when I got home, there was an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a letter on HOA letterhead, signed by Deborah Patterson in her capacity as president. Dear Mr. Morrison, it read. This letter serves as official notice that you are in violation of Meadowbrook Heights HOA bylaws, Section 12, Paragraph 4, which states that no power equipment may be operated before 7:00 a.m. on weekdays or 8:00 a.m. on weekends and holidays. Your operation of a snow plow at approximately 5:00 a.m. on February 12, 2025, constitutes a clear violation of this bylaw. You are hereby fined $250, payable within 30 days. Continued violations will result in additional fines and potential legal action. As a community, we must all work together to maintain peaceful and pleasant living conditions for all residents. $250 for plowing my own driveway. I felt my blood pressure rising as I read the letter again, looking for any wiggle room, any reasonable interpretation that might make this make sense. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws, which I'd received when I bought the house over 2 decades ago. The document was nearly 30 pages of dense legal language covering everything from fence heights to approved paint colors. I found Section 12 and read through it carefully. Sure enough, paragraph 4 did say what Deborah claimed, but there was something she'd conveniently left out. Paragraph 5, directly below it, stated that exceptions may be granted for necessary activities related to health, safety, or access, at the discretion of the HOA board. That seemed pretty relevant. Snow removal was definitely related to safety and access. And the bylaw said the board could grant exceptions, not that residents needed to apply for them in advance. A reasonable board president would recognize that early morning snow removal after a significant snowfall was exactly the kind of situation that warranted an automatic exception. But Deborah Patterson didn't strike me as a reasonable board president. I decided to call Tom Henderson, who'd been around the neighborhood almost as long as I had. He answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said. "You got the letter. $250 fine. You?" "Yeah, same. So did the Kowalskis, the Chens, and basically everyone on our street who cleared their driveway before 7 a.m. She's on a rampage. This is insane. Did you read paragraph 5? There's an exception for necessary activities. I mentioned that when she came to my door. She said the exception only applies if we request it in advance in writing and the board approves it. I pointed out that kind of defeats the purpose when it's an emergency situation like a snowstorm, and she said that failure to plan ahead doesn't constitute an emergency on our part. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. What are people planning to do? Most folks are just going to pay it. $250 sucks, but it's not worth the hassle of fighting. The Kowalskis are mad enough that they're talking about hiring a lawyer, but I don't know if they'll actually follow through. What about you? Tom was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I'm probably going to pay it. My wife doesn't want the stress of dealing with Deborah, and I get it. The woman is relentless, but if you want to fight it, I'll back you up however I can. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. I spent the rest of the evening researching HOA law in Minnesota, and what I found was both enlightening and frustrating. HOAs had broad authority to enforce their bylaws, but they also had to follow their own rules and act reasonably. The problem was that challenging them usually meant going to court, which was expensive and time-consuming. The next morning, I was back out at 5 a.m. with my plow. We'd gotten another 3 inches overnight, nothing major, but enough that the driveway needed clearing. I just finished when I saw Deborah's front door open. She stood there in her bathrobe again, phone in hand, glaring at me across the distance. I gave her a friendly wave and headed inside. 20 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Jake standing there, this time in civilian clothes. It was his day off. "Hey, Dad, got a minute, of course. Come in. Coffee?" "Yeah, thanks." We sat at my kitchen table, steaming mugs in front of us. Jake looked uncomfortable, which wasn't like him. "So that woman, Deborah Patterson, she called the station 6 times yesterday. Twice she asked for Captain Rodriguez to file a complaint about how I handled the call. Then she called back 4 more times to report various noise violations around the neighborhood. I'm sorry you got dragged into this. It's not your fault, but there's more. She filed a formal complaint stating that I showed bias because I'm your son and that I should have recused myself from the call. I set down my mug a little harder than intended. You've got to be kidding me. I wish I was. Captain Rodriguez told her that it was irrelevant because no laws were being broken anyway, but she's threatening to go to the city council, the mayor, whoever will listen. She's claiming corruption and favoritism. This is getting out of hand. Yeah. And here's the thing, I looked into her a bit. Just public record stuff, nothing invasive. Guess what I found? What? She's been president of 3 different HOAs in 3 different states over the past 10 years. In each case, she lasted about a year before either being voted out or investigated for misuse of funds or abuse of authority. In Colorado, she was actually sued by 17 homeowners and lost. The judgment against her was for excessive and punitive fines that violated the HOA's own bylaws. This was news to me. How did she end up here, my guess? She keeps moving before her reputation catches up with her, but she's got a pattern. She targets people she thinks won't fight back, uses the HOA as her personal fiefdom, and then bails when things get too hot. So what do we do? Jake leaned back in his chair. Legally, I can't do much. She hasn't broken any criminal laws, at least not yet, but you could fight the fine. If you request a hearing with the HOA board, they're required to give you one, and if the board upholds the fine, you could take it to civil court. Given her history, a judge might be very interested in her pattern of behavior. That sounds expensive. It could be. But Dad, if nobody stands up to people like her, they just keep doing it. How many other people in this neighborhood can't afford a random $250 fine? How many are on fixed incomes or tight budgets? She's basically extorting people. He had a point. I thought about my neighbors, many of whom were elderly or young families just starting out. $250 might not break my bank, but it could be a real hardship for others. All right, I said. I'll fight it. What do I need to do? Jake smiled. That's what I was hoping you'd say. First, write a letter to the HOA board formally disputing the fine and requesting a hearing. Send it certified mail so you have proof of delivery. In the letter, cite paragraph 5 about exceptions for necessary activities. Also, document everything. Every interaction with Deborah, every letter, every fine. Build a paper trail. Over the next week, I did exactly that. I wrote a detailed letter explaining why my snow removal was necessary and fell under the exception clause. I got statements from Tom and several other neighbors about the timing and necessity of early morning plowing. I even got a letter from my supervisor at the hospital confirming my work schedule and the importance of reliable attendance. The HOA board consisted of 5 members. Deborah as president, a vice president named Gary Thornton, a secretary named Lisa Wu, a treasurer named Patricia Donnelly, and a member-at-large named Frank Kowalski. Yes, the same Kowalski who'd also been fined for early morning plowing. I received a response 2 weeks later scheduling a hearing for March 1st at 7 p.m. in the community center. The letter was coldly formal and signed by Lisa Wu as secretary. It informed me that I would have 15 minutes to present my case and that the board would render a decision within 5 business days. The night of the hearing, I arrived at the community center with a folder full of documentation. The room was set up with a long table at the front where the board members sat, and rows of chairs facing them. I was surprised to see that nearly 40 neighbors had shown up, far more than usually attended HOA meetings. Deborah called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. She went through some routine business first, approving minutes from the last meeting and discussing the budget for landscaping. Then she turned her attention to me. Next on the agenda, we have an appeal from Zachary Morrison regarding a fine issued for violation of noise restrictions. Mr. Morrison, you have 15 minutes. I stood and walked to the front of the room. Thank you. I'm here tonight because I believe the fine I received was unjust and contrary to the HOA's own bylaws. On February 12th, I was fined $250 for operating a snowplow at 5 a.m. However, Section 12, Paragraph 5 of our bylaws clearly states that exceptions can be made for necessary activities related to health, safety, or access. Deborah interrupted. Paragraph 5 requires advance written approval from the board. Actually, it doesn't. I have the bylaws right here. I held up my copy. Paragraph 5 says exceptions may be granted by the board, but it doesn't require advance approval. A reasonable interpretation would be that the board has discretion to recognize when exceptions apply. That's your interpretation, Deborah said dismissively. It's the plain language of the bylaw. Furthermore, snow removal after a significant overnight snowfall is exactly the kind of necessary activity the exception was designed for. I need to be at work by 7 a.m. I work at the hospital in an essential role. If I can't clear my driveway, I can't get to work, and that impacts patient care. Gary Thornton, the vice president, spoke up. He was a reasonable guy in his 60s who'd always struck me as fair-minded. Zachary makes a good point. We can't expect people to request advance approval for weather events. That doesn't make sense. The rule is clear, Deborah insisted. No power equipment before 7 a.m. If we start making exceptions, the whole bylaw becomes meaningless. But we already have an exception written into the bylaw, Frank Kowalski pointed out. Seems like the people who wrote it understood there would be situations like this. Patricia Donnelly, the treasurer, was looking through her own copy of the bylaws. I have to say, I'm inclined to agree with Zachary. The exception clause seems pretty applicable here. This is exactly the kind of thinking that leads to chaos, Deborah said, her voice rising. Today it's snow plowing. Tomorrow it's lawn mowing at dawn, then leaf blowers, then who knows what. We have rules for a reason, Lisa Wu, the secretary, had been quiet up to this point. Actually, I think there's a difference between routine maintenance like lawn mowing and emergency situations like snow removal. The bylaw seems to contemplate that. Deborah's face was turning red. I'm the president of this board, and I'm telling you that we need to uphold the fine. If we don't, we're setting a precedent that people can just ignore our rules whenever they feel like it. Tom Henderson stood up from the audience. Can I say something? This isn't an open forum, Deborah snapped. Actually, Gary said mildly, our bylaws allow for community input at board meetings. Go ahead, Tom. Thanks. Look, I got one of these fines too, so did a bunch of other people here tonight, and I've got to say it feels pretty arbitrary. The Kowalskis were plowing at 4:45, I was out at 5, Zachary was at 5, the Chens were at 5:30. We all got the same fine. But meanwhile, nobody said anything to the Johnsons who were plowing at 6:45 or the Martins who were out at 6:30. Why? Because Deborah has decided that the magic number is 7 a.m., even though the difference between plowing at 6:45 and 7 is basically nothing in terms of noise impact. Several other neighbors voiced their agreement. I could see Deborah's jaw tightening. The line has to be drawn somewhere, she said. 7 a.m. is that line. But the bylaw itself says there are exceptions, Patricia pointed out again. I move that we vote to overturn Zachary's fine on the grounds that his activity clearly fell under the necessary exception. I second that motion, Gary said immediately. Deborah looked like she wanted to argue further, but the parliamentary procedure was clear. All in favor. Gary, Patricia, Lisa, and Frank all raised their hands. Opposed, only Deborah raised her hand. The motion carries 4-1. The fine is overturned. Gary's voice was firm and final. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Thank you. However, Deborah said, her voice sharp, I want it noted in the minutes that I strongly disagree with this decision and believe it sets a dangerous precedent. So noted, Lisa said, writing in her notebook. The meeting continued with several other neighbors who'd been fined presenting similar appeals. In each case, the vote was the same, 4-1 in favor of overturning the fines. By the end of the evening, Deborah looked like she was ready to explode. As people filed out, several neighbors came up to thank me for fighting the fine. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. That took guts, man. I'm glad you did it. Couldn't have done it without everyone backing me up. Frank Kowalski joined us. You know she's not going to let this go, right? She's going to be out for blood now. Let her try. The board voted, and that's that. But Frank was right to be concerned. Over the next few weeks, Deborah launched what could only be described as a campaign of harassment. She started doing daily inspections of the neighborhood, looking for any possible violation she could find. My garbage can was 2 inches over the property line. $25 fine. Tom's mailbox had a tiny patch of rust. $50 fine for improper maintenance. The Chen's daughter had left a bike on the front lawn overnight. $75 fine for unsightly storage. Every single fine was appealed, and every single one was overturned by the rest of the board. But it was exhausting and time-consuming. People had to take time off work to attend hearings, gather documentation, and defend themselves against increasingly petty accusations. Then things took a darker turn. In early April, Patricia Donnelly, the treasurer, requested an emergency board meeting. I wasn't on the board, but Tom was friends with Patricia and he told me what happened. Patricia had been doing the quarterly financial review, which was part of her duties as treasurer. She'd noticed some irregularities in the HOA's accounts. Specifically, there were several payments to a company called Meadowbrook Management Solutions for consulting services. The payments totaled nearly $15,000 over the past 6 months. The problem was that nobody on the board except Deborah knew anything about these payments. When Patricia asked about them, Deborah claimed they were for professional HOA management advice and that she had authority to approve them under her discretionary budget. Except there was no discretionary budget in the HOA bylaws. Every expenditure over $500 required board approval. And when Patricia tried to look up Meadowbrook Management Solutions, she found that it was a shell company registered to a P.O. box in South Dakota. The registered agent, Deborah Patterson, Deborah had been paying herself thousands of dollars in HOA funds through a fake consulting company. Patricia brought this information to the emergency board meeting. According to Tom, who heard it from Patricia later, Deborah tried to brazen it out at first, claiming the payments were legitimate and that she'd provided valuable services. But when Gary demanded to see the consulting reports and documentation of services rendered, she couldn't produce anything. The board voted unanimously, 4-0 with Deborah abstaining, to suspend her as president pending an investigation. They also voted to contact the police. That's when Jake got involved again, this time in his official capacity. He and another detective interviewed Deborah, examined the financial records, and built a case for embezzlement. The evidence was clear. Deborah had created a fake company, authorized payments to herself without board approval, and stolen HOA funds. In Minnesota, embezzlement of over $10,000 is a felony. On May 15th, Jake and 2 other officers arrested Deborah at her home. I wasn't there, But Tom, who lived close enough to see, told me she screamed and cried and insisted it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd done so much work for the HOA and deserved to be compensated. The problem with that argument was that HOA presidents are volunteer positions. If she'd wanted to be paid for her work, she should have proposed it to the board and the membership. Instead, she just helped herself to community funds. The arrest made the local news. HOA president arrested for embezzlement was the headline in the Meadowbrook Heights Gazette. The story detailed not just the local charges, but also her history in other states. Apparently, once the police started digging, they found that she'd pulled similar schemes in Colorado and Oregon. She'd managed to stay just under the threshold for felony charges in those cases, and the previous HOAs had settled rather than pursuing criminal charges. But this time, she'd gotten greedy. The legal process moved slowly, as these things do. Deborah hired a lawyer who tried to argue that the payments were authorized and that it was a civil matter, not criminal. But the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Caroline Garcia, had a solid case. The board had clear records showing no approval for the payments, and the fake company was obviously a scheme to hide the embezzlement. In September, Deborah took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of felony embezzlement in exchange for the prosecution dropping additional fraud charges. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with 2 years suspended, meaning she'd serve 1 year. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus fines and court costs. The judge, a no-nonsense man named Harold Martinez, didn't mince words during sentencing. Miss Patterson, you violated the trust of your community. You took a volunteer position meant to serve your neighbors and used it to steal from them. You created fake companies, forged documents, and when caught, you tried to blame everyone but yourself. This court finds your actions reprehensible. I'm sentencing you to the maximum within the plea agreement because I believe you need time to reflect on the harm you've caused. I attended the sentencing hearing along with several other neighbors. It felt important to be there, to see justice done. When Deborah was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked small and defeated, nothing like the angry, imperious woman who'd marched across the snow in her pink bathrobe to yell at me about my snow plow. After Deborah's removal, the HOA board held elections for a new president. Gary Thornton won easily. His first act was to review all the fines issued during Deborah's tenure and refund the ones that people had paid under protest. He also proposed amending the bylaws to clarify the exception clause for necessary activities and to add more oversight for financial decisions. The amendments were put to a vote of the full membership and passed overwhelmingly. The new bylaws were clear and reasonable, designed to maintain the neighborhood without being oppressive. Gary proved to be an excellent president, the kind of person who understood that the HOA existed to serve the homeowners, not the other way around. Life in Meadowbrook Heights returned to something resembling normal. Tom and I still got together for beers on the weekends, though now we had a hell of a story to tell. Frank Kowalski started a neighborhood watch program, which was actually pretty useful. The Chen's daughter, who was now allowed to leave her bike on the lawn, became good friends with one of the Henderson kids. Jake got a commendation for his work on the embezzlement case. It wasn't his biggest bust or most dangerous call, but it showed the kind of thorough, professional police work that made me so proud of him. He'd followed the evidence, built a solid case, and helped ensure that someone who'd been abusing her authority faced consequences. As for me, I kept plowing my driveway at 5 a.m. whenever it snowed. Nobody complained. In fact, after the first big snowfall of the following winter, Tom texted me, "Heard your plow this morning. music to my ears. The whole experience taught me some important lessons. First, that standing up to bullies matters, even when it's easier to just pay the fine and move on. Second, that communities work best when people look out for each other rather than trying to control each other. And third, that sometimes karma has a sense of humor, sending your cop son to respond to a Karen's ridiculous complaint. I thought about my late wife sometimes, wondering what she'd have made of the whole situation. She'd always been better at dealing with difficult people than I was. But I think she'd have been proud that I stood my ground, that I didn't let Deborah push me or my neighbors around. The following February, almost exactly a year after the initial confrontation, we got hit with a massive blizzard. 16 inches fell overnight, and the temperature dropped to -10. I was out at 4:30 in the morning, earlier than usual, clearing my driveway. The work was harder with that much snow, and my breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air. I'd been at it for about 45 minutes when I saw headlights approaching. Jake's patrol car pulled up and he rolled down his window. "Everything okay, Dad? Just plowing." "Why did someone call in a complaint?" he laughed. "No, I'm just doing my rounds." "Wanted to make sure you weren't frozen solid out here." "I'm good. Coffee's on inside if you want to warm up." "Can't, still on duty, but I'll swing by after my shift. We can have breakfast." "Sounds good." He drove off and I went back to work. The sky was starting to lighten, that same deep blue-purple I'd seen a year ago. But this time, there was no angry woman in a pink bathrobe, no threats, no drama. Just me, my plow, and the peaceful early morning silence of a sleeping neighborhood. I finished the driveway, cleared the sidewalk, and headed inside. The house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of coffee and the promise of a good breakfast with my son. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered streets in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a good day. By the time Jake arrived around 8, I'd showered and started cooking. Eggs, bacon, toast, the works. He came in stamping snow off his boots, his cheeks red from the cold. "Smells great in here. Figured you'd be hungry after your shift." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd strategized about fighting the HOA fine, where we'd discussed Deborah's arrest, where we'd shared countless meals over the years. The morning light streamed through the window, making the snow outside sparkle like diamonds. "You know," Jake said between bites of bacon, "that whole thing with Deborah Patterson is already becoming kind of legendary at the station. New recruits hear the story and can't believe someone actually called the cops on their neighbor for snow plowing, then got arrested for embezzlement. Life's funny that way." "It is. But seriously, Dad, I'm glad you fought back. A lot of people wouldn't have. I had good support, and a good cop for a son." He smiled at that. We finished breakfast and talked about other things, work and weather and his latest dating adventures. Normal father-son stuff. But there was an underlying contentment to the conversation, a sense that we'd been through something together and come out stronger for it. After Jake left, I spent some time looking through old photos. I found one of my wife, taken shortly before she died, standing in front of this house. She'd loved this place, loved the neighborhood and the life we'd built here. I was glad I'd fought to protect it, not just for me but for her memory. The community had changed over the years, as communities do. Young families moved in, older residents moved to retirement communities, houses changed hands. But the core of what made Meadowbrook Heights a good place to live remained. Neighbors who looked out for each other, who stood together against those who'd abused their power, who understood that rules should serve people, not the other way around. Gary Thornton proved to be not just a good HOA president but a great one. He organized neighborhood events, from summer barbecues to holiday decorating contests. He worked with the city to get better snow removal on the main roads and lobbied for a new stop sign at a dangerous intersection. Under his leadership, the HOA became what it was supposed to be, a tool for improving the community, not controlling it. The money that Deborah embezzled was eventually repaid through a combination of her restitution payments and insurance. The HOA used some of it to create a reserve fund for emergencies and invested the rest in community improvements. We got new playground equipment at the park, better lighting on the walking paths, and a renovation of the community center. I continued working at the hospital, continued plowing my driveway before dawn when needed, continued living my life. But I was more aware now of the importance of civic engagement, of paying attention to who holds power in your community and how they use it. I started attending more HOA meetings, not because I wanted to be on the board, but because I wanted to stay informed and involved. Tom and I remained close friends. His wife, Martha, would often joke that I was the reason their HOA fees went to useful things instead of lining Deborah's pockets. I'd protest that plenty of other people had stood up too, but she'd just laugh and insist on crediting me. The Kowalskis became friends as well. Frank had taken Deborah's betrayal particularly hard since he'd been on the board and felt he should have caught the embezzlement sooner. I reminded him that Deborah had been skilled at deception, and that he wasn't responsible for her crimes. Over time, he forgave himself and became an advocate for greater financial transparency in HOA operations. Caroline Garcia, the prosecutor who'd handled Deborah's case, actually reached out to me about 6 months after the sentencing. She was working on an initiative to educate HOA boards about their legal responsibilities and wanted to use our case as an example. I agreed to speak at a few sessions, sharing my experience and emphasizing the importance of checks and balances in community governance. It was strange being something of a minor local celebrity for a while. The newspaper did a follow-up story. Homeowner who fought back against corrupt HOA president. Local news stations interviewed me. I even got invited to speak at a state legislature committee hearing about HOA reform. Through it all, I tried to stay grounded and remember that I was just a guy who'd refused to pay an unjust fine. The real heroes were the neighbors who'd backed me up, the board members who'd done the right thing when they discovered the embezzlement, and Jake and the police department for taking the case seriously. Speaking of Jake, he continued to excel in his career. By the end of that year, he'd been promoted to detective, a position he'd been working toward for years. His work on the Deborah Patterson case had been a factor, along with several other successful investigations. I'd never been prouder. The holidays that year were particularly special. Jake brought his girlfriend to Christmas dinner, a kind and intelligent woman named Emily who worked as a teacher. Watching them together, seeing Jake happy and settled, reminded me of the early days with my wife. The cycle of life continuing, new love blooming, the future unfolding. We ate turkey and mashed potatoes and pumpkin pie. We exchanged gifts and told stories. And at one point, Emily asked about that crazy HOA lady she'd heard about. Jake and I exchanged glances and launched into the tale, tag-teaming the narrative, filling in details for each other. "So wait," Emily said when we finished. "She actually called the police on you for plowing snow, and Jake was the responding officer. That's incredible." The look on her face when she realized he was my son, I said, shaking my head at the memory. Priceless. "I tried so hard to stay professional," Jake added. "But inside I was dying. Here's this woman in a pink bathrobe at 5 a.m. screaming about noise ordinances, and I'm just thinking, lady, do you not have anything better to do?" We laughed, and the story became part of our family lore, something we'd retell at gatherings for years to come. But beneath the humor was something more serious. Deborah Patterson's arrest and conviction sent a message throughout the community and beyond. HOA board members couldn't act with impunity. They were accountable to the homeowners they served, and if they broke the law, they'd face consequences. Several other HOAs in the area reviewed their financial controls after hearing about our case. A few discovered minor irregularities, nothing as severe as what Deborah had done, but issues nonetheless. The increased scrutiny was healthy, a reminder that sunshine is the best disinfectant for corruption. As winter turned to spring and then summer, life in Meadowbrook Heights settled into a pleasant rhythm. I tended my garden, worked my shifts at the hospital, had dinner with Jake and Emily. Simple pleasures, but meaningful ones. On the anniversary of Deborah's sentencing, Gary organized a community meeting to discuss the past year and look ahead. Nearly 100 people showed up, more than had attended any HOA meeting in years. Gary talked about the importance of learning from what happened, of staying vigilant against those who'd abuse positions of trust, but also of moving forward with optimism and community spirit. What Deborah Patterson did was wrong, he said. But the way this community responded, the way we came together and supported each other, that's what defines us. Not the actions of one corrupt individual, but the response of hundreds of good neighbors who refused to be victims. There was applause, and I felt a swell of pride in our little corner of Minnesota. We'd been tested and we'd passed. We'd faced down a bully and a thief, and we'd come out stronger. After the meeting, several people approached me to share their own stories of dealing with Deborah's tyranny. The elderly couple who'd been fined for having lawn ornaments that were too whimsical. The single dad who'd been cited for his grass being a half-inch too long. The young couple who'd been threatened with legal action for painting their shutters the wrong shade of brown. Each story reinforced how much damage one person in a position of power could do, and how important it was to stand up to them. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the journey from that cold February morning when Deborah had first marched across the snow to yell at me. So much had happened in such a relatively short time. A simple dispute over snow plowing had uncovered embezzlement, led to a criminal conviction, and ultimately strengthened an entire community. I thought about fate and timing. What if Jake hadn't been the responding officer that morning? Would things have played out differently? What if I'd just paid the fine like most people did? Would Deborah's embezzlement have continued unchecked? There were no clear answers to these questions, just the knowledge that sometimes small acts of resistance ripple outward in unexpected ways. The following winter was mercifully mild. We got snow, of course. This was Minnesota, but nothing like the storms of the previous year. I still plowed my driveway early when needed, but it became routine again, unremarkable, which was exactly as it should be. Jake and Emily got engaged in March, and I couldn't have been happier. They asked me to help plan the wedding, and I dove into the task with enthusiasm. My wife would have loved Emily, I was sure of it. She had that same combination of kindness and strength, the same ability to bring out the best in people. The wedding was in June, a beautiful outdoor ceremony at a venue just outside the city. The weather cooperated perfectly, sunny and warm with a light breeze. Standing there watching Jake and Emily exchange vows, I felt my late wife's presence strongly, as if she was standing beside me, sharing in this moment of joy. Tom was there with Martha, and Frank and his wife, and dozens of other neighbors from Meadowbrook Heights. Our community had become more than just people who happened to live near each other. We were connected by shared experience, by having faced adversity together and prevailed. At the reception, during his speech, Jake thanked me for being a great father and role model. "You taught me to stand up for what's right," he said, "even when it's difficult, even when it would be easier to just go along. That lesson has guided me throughout my career and my life, and I'm grateful for it every day." I wasn't usually an emotional man, but I'll admit my eyes got a little misty hearing that. The months and years that followed were good ones. I watched Jake and Emily build their life together, eventually buying a house of their own in a nearby neighborhood with, mercifully, a much less active HOA. I continued my work at the hospital, taking pride in keeping everything running smoothly. I maintained my home and my garden, spent time with friends, lived a full and satisfying life. Deborah Patterson was released from prison after serving her full year. She moved out of state shortly after, and as far as I know, she never returned to Minnesota. I sometimes wondered if she'd learned anything from her experience, if she'd reflected on her actions and changed her ways. But ultimately, that was her journey, not mine. What mattered was that our community had survived her tenure and thrived afterward. The HOA that Gary and the board built was everything an HOA should be: helpful, transparent, and focused on genuinely improving life for residents. When Gary eventually stepped down after several years of excellent service, he was replaced by Lisa Wu, who continued in the same vein. "I'm retired now, no longer making that early morning drive to the hospital. But I still plow my driveway whenever it snows, often at the crack of dawn, simply because I'm an early riser and I enjoy the peace of morning. Sometimes I see neighbors doing the same, and we'll wave to each other across the white landscape, part of an unspoken brotherhood of early risers and snow plow operators. Jake and Emily have 2 kids now, a boy and a girl, my grandchildren. They come to visit often, and I tell them stories about their dad growing up, about their grandmother they never got to meet, and yes, about the time a crazy lady called the cops on their grandpa for plowing snow. The story always makes them laugh, especially the part about their dad showing up in his police uniform. To them, it's just a funny family tale. But to me, it's a reminder of an important time, a moment when I chose to stand up rather than back down, and how that choice cascaded into something much bigger than I could have imagined. The lessons from that winter have stayed with me. That small acts of courage matter. That communities are only as strong as the willingness of their members to stand up for each other. That those who abuse power must face consequences. And that sometimes, justice arrives in unexpected ways, like a police officer who happens to be your son responding to a ridiculous complaint at 5 in the morning. Life in Meadowbrook Heights continues to be good. We're not perfect. No community is. We still have occasional disputes about parking or noise, or whose responsibility it is to trim the tree that hangs over the property line. But we handle these things like neighbors should, with conversation and compromise, not with threats and fines. The community center has a plaque now, installed by unanimous vote of the HOA membership. It reads, "In memory of the winter of 2025, when this community came together to stand against corruption and for justice, may we always remember that we are strongest when we support each other." Some people might think it's overdramatic, a plaque commemorating what was essentially an HOA dispute. But those of us who lived through it understand. It wasn't really about snow plowing or noise ordinances or even embezzlement. It was about the kind of community we wanted to be, the kind of neighbors we wanted to have, the kind of values we wanted to uphold. And in the end, that's what matters most. I still think about that February morning sometimes, when I'm out early plowing fresh snow. I think about Deborah marching across the snow in her pink bathrobe, so certain of her authority, so convinced that she could bully me into submission. I think about Jake trying not to laugh as he professionally explained that no laws were being broken. I think about the moment in the board meeting when the vote came down 4-1 in my favor and the relief I felt. But mostly, I think about what came after. The discovery of the embezzlement, the arrest, the trial, the community coming together, the reforms and improvements. The friendships strengthened, the lessons learned. It's funny how life works sometimes. A simple dispute over when you can run a snow plow turns into a catalyst for exposing corruption and strengthening a community. A middle-aged woman's petty tyranny becomes her downfall. A police officer responding to a trivial complaint ends up investigating a felony. You can't predict these things. You can only do what you think is right in the moment and trust that things will work out as they should. And in our case, they did. So now, when I'm up at 5 a.m. on a snowy morning, scraping ice off my plow blade and preparing to clear my driveway, I do it with a sense of satisfaction. Not just because I'm maintaining my property or ensuring I can get to wherever I need to go, but because I know that in this neighborhood, in this community, we stood up to someone who tried to abuse her power. We said no to petty tyranny. We demanded accountability, and we won. That's worth more than a clear driveway, though I'll take that too. It's worth the early mornings and the cold fingers, and yes, even worth the hassle of fighting an unjust fine. Because in the end, it wasn't really about me at all. It was about all of us, about what we would tolerate and what we wouldn't, about the kind of place we wanted Meadowbrook Heights to be. I'm proud of my neighbors. I'm proud of my son. And I'm proud that when tested, I didn't back down. My wife always said that integrity is what you do when nobody's watching. But it's also what you do when everyone is watching, when it would be easier to just comply, when standing up means inviting conflict and hassle into your life. The snow keeps falling every winter, as it always does in Minnesota. And every winter, I keep plowing my driveway early in the morning as I always have. But now there's a deeper satisfaction to it, a sense that this simple act represents something larger. Freedom, justice, community, standing up for what's right. And if that makes me think of Deborah Patterson in her pink bathrobe, and remember the look on her face when Jake calmly explained that I wasn't breaking any laws, well, I can't help but smile at that memory. Not out of vindictiveness, but out of gratitude for how things turned out. Because that moment, that ridiculous confrontation on a freezing February morning, turned out to be the beginning of something important. It was the crack that exposed the rot beneath. And once exposed, we were able to clean it out and build something better. That's the real story. Not about a Karen calling the cops over snow plowing. Not about my son showing up and laughing at her. Those are just the entertaining details, the hooks that make people want to hear more. The real story is about ordinary people in an ordinary neighborhood who refused to be pushed around, who insisted on fairness and accountability, who stood together when it mattered most, and that's a story worth telling.